Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, right? You walk out your front door,
Yeah.
and you suddenly realize that the entire concept of a grocery store it no longer exists.
Yeah. It's just gone.
Exactly. Not just that the shelves are empty, but like the entire supply chain that brought the food there has completely evaporated. The local hospital has no power. The doctors have fled. The police department has just completely dissolved.
Right. There's no one to call.
Right. If your house catches on fire, nobody is coming.
Yeah.
The courts are empty buildings. It's like all the basic software of society has been uninstalled overnight, and absolutely no one has written the code to replace it.
Right.
And the crazy thing is, that isn't a post-apocalyptic movie plot.
No, it's really not.
That is the literal day after a successful revolution.
It is. It's the reality of a complete state collapse. And I mean, when we talk about being well-informed citizens of the world, this is the immense, heavy duality that you, as a learner, really have to grapple with. Because, you turn on the news and you see a crowd in the street, you see a palace falling or a flag being torn down on live television, and it represents this ultimate tangible hope.
Like the breaking of tyranny, right?
Exactly, the breaking of tyranny. But the historical aftermath of those exact same images so often brings just a terrifying vacuum that ushers in civil war, famine, and eventually a brand new dictatorship.
Which is really the core mission of our deep dive today. We are taking this massive stack of sources, historical analyses, political philosophy, sociological research, to unpack what might be the ultimate question about human civilization.
Right.
Are revolutions a necessary engine of progress, or are they a catastrophic disaster that we should avoid at all costs?
And we need to validate that sense of overwhelm you might feel when you look at these massive societal shifts. Because, we are not having a simple debate today about whether positive change is good.
Right. Obviously, creating a more just society is a good thing.
Right. The incredibly difficult question we're exploring is about the mechanical depth of that change. Like, can a fundamentally unjust system ever truly fix itself from the inside out?
Yeah, that's the real question.
And if it can't, how much sheer destruction, how much chaos can ever be morally justified in the hope of creating a better world?
Right. But before we can even begin to judge whether a revolution is a necessary cure or a fatal disease for a society, we really have to define the terms, I think.
Absolutely. The word gets thrown around constantly.
Oh, all the time. Like, a company releases a new smartphone and calls it revolutionary. A political party wins an election and calls it a revolution. So, based on our sources, what actually separates a true historical revolution from just, a highly intense weekend of protests or a major shift in the polls?
Well, the distinction is critical because those events, elections, protests, even temporary armed uprisings, they happen all the time.
Yeah, constantly.
But our sources are very clear that a revolution is something far more profound than just a change in government personnel. It's a rapid, fundamental transformation of political power.
Right.
It's the underlying institutions, the social structures, and the basic organizing principles of a society. It is an absolute rewiring of reality for the people living through it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we are going to use that term, we really need to know what it means on a street level. So let's try to make this incredibly concrete for everyone listening. Think of society like a house, right?
Okay, I like that.
A massive protest,
Yeah.
a new piece of legislation,
Right.
or even a highly contested election
Uh-huh.
that is essentially deciding you hate the wallpaper in the living room, so you scrape it off and paint it blue.
Right, cosmetic changes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or maybe you elect a new president of your homeowners association because
Yeah.
the last person was too strict about the height of your grass. You might be making significant changes. You're changing the temporary management of the property, but the house itself is still the same house. The floor plan is identical.
Yeah, the foundation remains completely intact. The actual rules of the neighborhood haven't changed at all.
Right. But a revolution is taking a sledgehammer to that foundation. It is ripping up the floorboards, tearing out the plumbing, pulling the electrical wires out of the drywall, and then completely rewriting the deed to the property so it legally belongs to someone else entirely.
You're not just remodeling the kitchen.
No, you are obliterating the house in the hope of building a completely different structure on the exact same plot of land while you and your family are still living on it.
That captures the sheer terrifying scale of it. Look at what the sources tell us a revolution actually dismantles.
Yeah. What goes?
Well, it changes who rules, obviously, but it also changes who is legally allowed to own property. It completely restructures how wealth is distributed in the society.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, it redefines which groups possess basic human rights. It obliterates the previous definition of what counts as legitimate authority.
So it's the difference between saying, the current king is levying too many taxes, we need a new king, versus saying the entire concept of a monarchy is an offense against human dignity, and anyone claiming to be a king is a criminal.
Exactly. And that transformation, it can take so many different forms. I mean, we see political revolutions, social, economic, anti-colonial, religious revolution.
Usually a messy mix of them, right?
Oh, almost always a highly volatile mixture of several of these happening at once. And while some historical revolutions have been, relatively limited in their scope, others attempt to remake every single facet of human existence.
Like down to the granular level.
Yes. They attempt to change the calendar to year zero. They dictate new ways citizens must address each other on the street. They even try to fundamentally alter the structure of the nuclear family.
That's just wild to think about. And so the obvious question then becomes about the moral weight of that scale. Like, why does the depth of that transformation matter so much when we evaluate these events?
Because the scale of the transformation dictates the scale of the risk. The greater the structural change you attempt, the greater the possibility for an extreme, unprecedented liberation. You are, in effect, wiping a corrupt slate entirely clean.
But I'm guessing there's a pretty massive flip side to that.
Oh, absolutely. Simultaneously, by removing all the traditional guardrails of society at once, you are opening the door to an equally extreme possibility of catastrophe.
Which sets up a massive psychological hurdle. I mean,
Yeah.
if the stakes are that incredibly high, if total catastrophe, civil war, and widespread famine are genuinely on the table the moment the state collapses, why would any society willingly pick up that sledgehammer?
Right.
Nobody wakes up on a Tuesday and decides to risk their life and their family's safety for an abstract political theory.
They don't. And our sources point out that this level of rupture happens because of structural, deeply entrenched injustice.
With structural injustice.
Yeah, in any society with profound inequality, that injustice almost always benefits a specific identifiable group. It benefits the elites who control the wealth, the legal apparatus, the military force, the education systems, and of course, the political institutions.
And I assume those powerful groups have absolutely zero incentive to accept any kind of meaningful reform that would, dilute their own power.
History shows us they rarely, if ever, surrender power voluntarily. I mean, why would they? Why would they give up the very mechanisms that secure their comfort, their safety, and their dominance?
Right, so what do they do when the pressure builds?
Well, when they face mounting pressure from the populace, they rely on a very specific playbook. They offer symbolic concessions. They offer slow, drawn-out promises of future studies.
The classic "we'll look into it" committee.
Exactly. They might make minor aesthetic adjustments to the machinery of government, but they vigorously protect the overarching structure that keeps them on top.
But wait, playing devil's advocate here for the listener. If the system is unjust and the elites are stalling, why jump straight to a sledgehammer? I think a natural reaction for a lot of people living in relatively stable democracies is to ask, why not just vote them out? Why not organize a grassroots movement, run for local office, and rewrite the laws piece by piece?
That's a fair question, but the revolutionary counter-argument detailed in our sources is that the system cannot be repaired, because the people expected to repair it are the exact same people benefiting from its injustice.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the legal channels you're suggesting people use, the courts, the elections, the legislative bodies, they are designed, funded, and controlled by the oppressors.
So you are asking a population to play a game where the opposing team also employs the referees, owns the stadium, and is allowed to change the rules in the middle of the fourth quarter.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the revolutionary perspective argues that changing one law at a time is completely useless if the entire structure is dependent on a foundational injustice.
Like what kind of foundational injustice?
Our sources highlight examples like chattel slavery, absolute colonial domination, hereditary caste privilege, rigid racial hierarchy, or extreme monopolistic wealth concentration.
Right, like if your entire society's agricultural economy is legally and culturally based on slavery, you can't just pass a reform bill saying slaves now get an extra hour of rest on Sundays and call that a victory for human rights.
It cannot, because the injustice in that scenario isn't a minor bug in the system. It is the operating system itself.
Wow, okay.
If injustice is structural, then structural transformation is required. The old system must literally be broken apart before a more just one can even begin to be designed.
So revolution is often framed in these texts as a brutal necessity then.
Yes. It emerges only when reform is repeatedly blocked, when peaceful dissent is violently suppressed, and when the institutions themselves are weapons used against the people.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The sources suggest something beyond just changing the laws, which I found fascinating. They talk about revolution acting as a mechanism that forcefully expands a society's political imagination.
Yes, this is a crucial psychological component of revolutions that we often miss when we just look at the timeline of battles and regime changes.
Let's talk about that. Think about the societal mindset before a revolution kicks off. Certain ideas aren't just unpopular, they're considered literally impossible, right? Utopian nonsense.
Exactly, like the idea that a peasant is equal to a lord.
Right. Or that a colonized nation could govern itself, or that workers should actually own the factory. But the sheer physical act of rising up makes those impossible ideas suddenly seem tangible. It forcefully accelerates demands for universal rights.
And the fascinating part of this dynamic is how this expansion of human imagination happens even if the revolution ultimately fails.
I want to dig into that. How does a failed revolution, one that ends with the old regime staying in power and crushing the uprising, how does that still manage to transform public consciousness?
Because it shatters an illusion.
Okay, what illusion?
It proves to the ordinary citizen that these massive, intimidating institutions, the monarchy, the colonial empire, the seemingly permanent class system, they are not handed down by the gods.
Right, they are gravity.
No, they're not permanent features of the natural world like a mountain range or an ocean. They are human creations. And because they were built by humans, they can be dismantled by humans.
So even if the state crushes the rebellion today, the populace now knows that the state is vulnerable.
Precisely. It permanently alters the horizon of what a society can dream of asking for. The psychological barrier is broken.
Dreaming of a new world, shattering the chains, building a utopia. I mean, it is incredibly inspiring rhetoric. But waking up the day after you've smashed the old world, the day after you've unplugged the master server of society like we talked about earlier, that brings us directly into the catastrophic risks.
Yes, it does.
Let's look at the dark side of our mission today. Why do these inspiring movements so frequently become disastrous?
They become disastrous because of the vacuum of order. When an oppressive state collapses, the oppression stops. But everything else stops too.
Right, the administrative capacity of society vanishes.
Yes. Going back to that day after scenario, you have successfully overthrown the dictator. The statues are toppled.
But now what? The sanitation workers aren't getting paid, so the garbage is piling up in the streets, spreading disease.
Exactly. The currency might hyperinflate overnight because the central bank has no backing. The supply chains freeze because truck drivers aren't going to transport food into a city with no law enforcement.
So the revolutionaries might know exactly what they hated about the old regime, but they rarely have workable, functioning institutions ready to just drop into place to manage a modern electrical grid.
And nature abhors a vacuum. Our sources make it explicitly clear. The immediate result of state collapse is almost never freedom.
What is it then?
The immediate result is chaos, armed competition, the rise of local warlords, widespread criminal violence, and the mass displacement of people who are just desperately trying to survive the breakdown of basic services.
So when the unjust order falls, the void is rapidly filled by whoever has the most weapons, basically.
Whoever has the most weapons, the best organization, or the highest capacity for ruthlessness.
And that chaotic environment seems to trigger a really dark psychological shift in the population. The source has spent a lot of time discussing how revolutions actively reward political extremes.
What's fascinating here is how the atmosphere of a revolution completely distorts human psychology and morality. I mean, a revolutionary situation is at its core a situation of intense, pervasive, daily fear.
Everyone is afraid.
Everyone. The revolutionaries are afraid the old regime will come back and execute them. The ordinary citizens are afraid of starving. And fear forces the human brain to divide the complex world into incredibly dangerous binaries.
You're forced into a box. You're either a friend or an enemy, right?
Right. A loyalist or a traitor. A pure revolutionary or a counter-revolutionary sympathizer. There is absolutely no room for nuance or gray area when people are terrified.
Under those psychological conditions, moderation, which is usually, the highest political virtue in a stable society, suddenly becomes highly suspicious.
Very suspicious. Let's imagine a hypothetical post-revolutionary town hall meeting, okay?
Okay, paint the picture.
You have citizens trying to figure out what to do with the minor bureaucrats from the old regime. A moderate stands up and says, we shouldn't execute them, they were just doing paperwork, maybe we should just bar them from future public office.
In a stable society, that's a totally reasonable compromise. But in a revolution, The person who stands up next points a finger at the moderate and screams, "Why are you defending the oppressors? You must be secretly working for them."
Exactly. Advocating for compromise makes you look like a traitor to the cause. So the people who scream the loudest, the people who demand the most extreme measures, the people who are the most uncompromising, they are the ones who capture the momentum of the crowd.
So the most disciplined and ruthless factions gain power. Because, in a time of absolute chaos, they offer the one thing people are desperate for: certainty, even if that certainty is violent.
This is precisely how a movement that started with a genuine, beautiful desire for human liberation transforms into something monstrous.
It turns inward.
Yes. The demand for purity leads to internal purges. It becomes about ideological policing, where simply thinking the wrong thought or associating with the wrong person is a capital crime.
Wow.
It turns into political terror and ultimately a new authoritarian rule that is often more heavily armed and paranoid than the regime it replaced.
And the violence just feeds itself. The sources note that revolutionary violence is uniquely dangerous because it becomes self-perpetuating. It might start as legitimate, targeted anger against a specific oppressor, say, attacking the royal guard, but very quickly, that anger curdles into broad revenge.
The scope of the violence expands outward. It stops being about resisting the rulers and starts being about punishing whole classes of people.
Right. Whole communities, entire families are targeted not for anything they actually did, but for who they are, what class they belong to, or what historical group they represent.
And once that level of brutality becomes normalized in the streets, every single new act of violence creates a retroactive justification for the next one.
They killed our people yesterday, so we have to wipe out their entire faction today to ensure our own safety. It's just an endless loop.
This is the tragic metamorphosis our sources warn about. The revolution stops being about merely changing institutions. The violence begins reshaping the moral culture of the society itself.
How so?
Well, the new culture becomes centered around mutual suspicion, around the rapid application of brute force to solve disagreements, around absolute obedience to the new leaders, and around a perpetual, exhausting hatred of internal and external enemies.
That is a chilling thought. The very means they use to create the new society end up permanently defining what that new society actually is.
Yes.
You set out to destroy an oppressive order, only to find you've accidentally built a brand new cage using the exact same rubble.
And that reality makes the alternative seem vastly more appealing. If revolution is this deeply dangerous, volatile, explosive thing that frequently devours its own children, it makes perfect sense why so many political philosophers and ordinary people prefer to take the path of reform.
But the text forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Is slow and steady actually just a trap? Let's contrast these two approaches for a second. How do the sources define reform in opposition to revolution?
Reform seeks gradual legal change. It relies on institutional improvement, on the electoral process, on negotiation, debate, and incremental policy transformation.
It operates entirely within the boundaries of the existing system.
Exactly, without triggering a total state collapse.
It's the boring stuff. Committee meetings, legislative amendments, zoning laws.
Boring, but vital to human flourishing. The massive advantage of reform is that it preserves stability. It preserves the accumulated generational knowledge of how to actually run a society.
It maintains social trust.
Yes, it keeps functioning institutions running, the hospitals stay open, the water keeps flowing. It allows a society to slowly improve its moral standing without destroying everything that the population depends on to survive the winter.
I see the logic there, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I want to push back on this concept of reform on behalf of anyone listening who might be looking at real systemic injustice in the world today. Because it is really, really easy for intellectuals or politicians to tell people to just be patient and take the gradual path when they aren't the ones paying the daily cost of that delay. Moderation often looks like a luxury of the comfortable.
That is the exact limitation of reform that the revolutionary texts highlight. Reform can simply be too slow.
Yeah.
If you are a marginalized group suffering severe, systemic, daily violence and economic starvation, gradual change doesn't sound like wisdom. It sounds like a death sentence.
It means accepting that another entire generation of your children will live without basic rights. It means another decade subjected to police violence or colonial extraction. It means endless, exhausting requests from the people in power, asking you for just a little more patience. We'll get to your humanity in the next legislative session. It's incredibly insulting.
And it's not just that reform is slow. If we connect this to the bigger picture, our sources point out that elites actively and strategically weaponize the concept of reform.
Oh, absolutely. Elites are highly adaptable organisms. They aren't stupid. They will use the language and the mechanisms of reform to intentionally absorb and neutralize opposition. They use it to delay actual material transformation.
We can picture this clearly. When faced with a massive protest movement demanding sweeping economic changes, the elite class doesn't just surrender their wealth.
Right. They don't hand over the keys to the factory.
No, instead, they form a blue ribbon committee for social progress. They issue a very somber, formal apology on state television. They lower a specific tax by a fraction of a percent.
They create the appearance of intense activity and progress.
Exactly, while ensuring their basic monopoly on power remains completely untouched.
It's a pressure valve on a steam engine.
Mm-hmm.
They let out just enough steam to stop the boiler from exploding, but they keep the fire burning underneath. They exhaust the reformers with bureaucracy until the momentum of the movement dies out.
So the core dilemma we're left with is this. Is the offer of reform a genuine path to justice in a given society? Or is it merely a strategic illusion designed to prevent deeper change?
And the answer to that relies entirely on an honest assessment of whether a society's institutions are actually capable of correcting themselves.
Right. If the courts are entirely corrupt and owned by the elites, if the elections are blatantly rigged, if the media is entirely state-controlled, then advocating for reform is advocating for a dead end.
And when reform is revealed to the populace to be a complete dead end, when that pressure valve finally fails, that is when the revolution kicks off. But there's a massive problem with how we perceive those moments. When we look back at historical revolutions in our textbooks, or when we watch them in movies, we tend to put them through this incredibly thick Hollywood filter.
Our sources refer to this as the myth of the clean revolution.
Yes. We love a simplified binary story. We love the narrative where the heroic, pure-hearted, unified people rise up as one singular force. The evil tyranny falls in a climactic, glorious battle, and then cue the swelling orchestral music. The sun rises, freedom begins, and everyone goes home happy to a functioning democracy.
But the historical reality, as our sources constantly remind us, is incredibly messy and morally mixed.
Yeah.
Revolutions certainly include moments of genuine courage, beautiful idealism, and immense self-sacrifice. But right alongside that, in the exact same events, often in the exact same individuals, you have naked opportunism, breathtaking cruelty, raw political ambition, horrific betrayal.
I'm stuck on the idea of the united people.
Yeah.
That seems to be the biggest myth of all.
Because it is. This raises an important question. Who exactly are the people? Because during the uprising, they're united by a common enemy. But the morning after the oppressor is gone, the various factions that made up the people look around and realize they want completely different, mutually exclusive things for the future of the country.
Let's walk through what that actually looks like on the ground.
Yeah.
You have a massive coalition that just overthrew a dictator. Okay. You might have one faction of urban university students who want a secular Western-style democracy. You have a faction of rural religious leaders who want a strict theocracy enforced by religious law. You have a labor faction that wants a state-planned socialist economy. You have elements of the military who join the uprising and now just want a military junta to ensure stability.
Right.
And you have a massive faction of people whose only political ideology is pure, unadulterated revenge against anyone associated with the old elites.
And without the gravitational pull of the common enemy to bind them together, those differences almost inevitably turn violent.
Because they can't compromise.
Exactly. The students want the universities open to all ideas. The religious leaders want strict moral codes enforced by militias. The alliance snaps. The revolutionaries turn their weapons on each other in a desperate bid to be the ones who get to write the new constitution.
Which means we have to be incredibly suspicious of the assumption that simply removing an oppressor automatically produces justice. Destroying the bad guy doesn't magically spawn good institutions.
It absolutely does not. Political freedom requires so much more than the capacity for destruction. It requires the tedious, incredibly difficult work of building norms, establishing independent courts, exercising restraint when you have the power to crush your enemies.
Which is really hard.
And, hardest of all, showing a willingness to share power with factions you might fiercely disagree with. Those are civic muscles that are almost impossible to build while you're in the chaotic, paranoid mindset of tearing a society down.
So what does this all mean when we try to evaluate a real event? If reform is often just a trap set by elites to maintain power, and revolution is this messy, violent, myth-laden explosion that frequently eats its own children, How on earth are we supposed to navigate this? If you're a learner watching a situation unfold in the world today, how do you know if a revolution is actually justified?
Our sources provide a remarkably clear, rigorous framework for this, a rubric, if you will, for judging a revolution. Because we cannot judge a historical rupture simply by how beautiful its slogans are, or even by how uniquely cruel the old regime was.
Right? Freedom, justice, and equality for all sounds amazing on a protest banner, but it doesn't tell me how you're going to manage the agricultural sector to prevent a famine next winter.
Precisely. We have to judge a revolution by its methods, by its likely consequences, by the institutions it actually manages to create, and crucially, by how it treats the people who disagree with it.
Let's spend some real time on this rubric. Our sources outline 6 conditions for a justified revolution. They frame revolution not as a glorious, romantic first choice, but as a solemn, moral last resort. So condition number 1, grave and structural injustice.
This condition demands that the situation cannot simply be general dissatisfaction with the economy or frustration that your preferred political party lost an election or anger over a specific unpopular policy.
Right, it has to be deeper.
It must be serious systemic domination or oppression. We are talking about absolute dictatorship, foreign colonial occupation, systematic violence against a minority population, or permanent structural exclusion of a class of people from society.
But how do you even measure that? It seems subjective.
It is difficult, but the sources point to a lack of basic human agency. If the state views a segment of its population as property, as subjects to be extracted from rather than citizens with rights, you are entering the territory of grave and structural injustice.
Okay, that makes sense. Condition 2, blocked peaceful reform. We touched on this, but what does blocked actually look like in practice? Is it just gerrymandering, or is it something more severe?
It is the complete sealing off of peaceful avenues. If people have meaningful access to elections, if there are independent courts that occasionally rule against the government, if there is freedom of speech and the right to organize labor unions, then a violent revolution is incredibly hard to morally defend, even if the system is deeply flawed.
Right, because you still have options.
Exactly. But if all those normal political channels are fraudulent, if the courts are show trials, if the free press is outlawed, and if peaceful protests are consistently met with live ammunition from state security forces, the case for revolution becomes much stronger. The state has removed any other option.
Okay, condition 3 is proportionality. This is the one that really trips me up.
It is the brutal, almost impossible calculus of war. The likely harms of the revolution, the thousands of deaths, the inevitable economic collapse, the mass displacement of refugees must not clearly exceed the injustice the revolution is trying to end.
But how can anyone possibly calculate proportionality in advance? How do you weigh a decade of systemic oppression and lack of voting rights against the potential deaths of a 3-year civil war with 100,000 casualties? Can you quantify freedom on a spreadsheet?
You can't put it on a spreadsheet, but the philosophical burden remains. It forces revolutionary leaders to ask themselves, is the cure worse than the disease?
Yeah.
You cannot destroy the entire village just to save it from a corrupt mayor. If overthrowing a corrupt government is guaranteed to trigger a decade-long sectarian bloodbath that kills millions, the condition of proportionality is not met, no matter how justified the initial anger was.
Condition 4, protection of civilians and opponents. Why is this so hard to maintain during mass paranoia?
Because the binary thinking we discussed earlier takes over. But this condition insists that a just cause does not give you a blank check for atrocities.
Right.
The desire for human liberation cannot justify unlimited cruelty, the use of torture, or the targeting of non-combatants, even if those non-combatants politically supported the old regime. If a revolutionary movement begins massacring the children of the old elites, it loses its moral justification entirely.
Condition 5. And this is the one that I think is the most frequently ignored in history. A credible post-revolutionary vision. I want to emphasize this for everyone listening. It is so easy to know what you are fighting against. It is easy to point at a dictator and say, that guy is the problem. But this rubric demands that you know exactly what you are fighting for.
You must have a realistic institutional plan for what comes next. Who governs the day after the dictator flees to another country?
Yeah, who takes out the trash?
Right. How exactly will minority rights be protected when the majority takes power? What are the specific legal mechanisms to limit the power of the new revolutionary leaders so they don't become dictators themselves? How will you stop the inevitable cycle of revenge killings?
If a revolutionary movement cannot provide credible, detailed answers to those logistical questions, they aren't offering a revolution. They're offering a blind leap into an unpredictable disaster.
Exactly. And finally, condition 6, a realistic possibility of improvement.
This means revolution cannot just be an exercise in symbolic destruction. It cannot be an expression of pure, nihilistic rage, no matter how justified that rage might feel in the moment. There must be a genuine, tactical, realistic path to actually making material life better for the people. You have to be able to turn the water back on.
It's an incredibly high bar, and I think it's important to pause here and note something fundamental about how we use this framework.
Sure, what's that?
When we apply the 6-point rubric to historical events or to things unfolding in the world right now, our goal as analysts is not to take a political side. We aren't endorsing any specific movement's ideology, whether left-wing or right-wing.
Right, this isn't about picking winners.
No, the purpose of this rubric, as drawn from our sources, is to provide an objective analytical lens. It allows us to impartially report on the mechanics of societal change and evaluate them structurally without getting swept away by the emotional rhetoric of the moment.
Exactly. It completely strips the romance out of the concept. Under this rigorous view, revolution is an extreme remedy for an extreme political disease. It is societal chemotherapy.
Which brings us to the final synthesis of our deep dive today. Based on this massive stack of sources, what is the ultimate nature of a revolution?
Revolution is best understood not as a guaranteed ticket to progress. It is a powerful historical rupture.
That is the perfect term, a rupture. It rips open the fabric of time and radically opens up the future of a society. But the critical takeaway for anyone studying history is that a rupture does not guarantee what enters through that opening.
No, it doesn't.
The forces that rush into that vacuum could be unprecedented human freedom, or they could be unprecedented terror.
It creates wild new possibilities, but the moral direction of those possibilities is entirely undecided at the moment the sledgehammer swings. Revolution is neither the natural, inevitable road to progress, nor is it a disaster that must always be avoided at all costs. It is a morally dangerous last resort.
Yes.
It becomes justifiable only when injustice is grave, structural, and completely immune to peaceful correction.
Having a just cause is simply not enough. You have to know what you're building in the ashes, and you have to know how to build it without becoming the monster you just defeated.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we usually leave you with questions from the text. But reading through these sources made me think about something entirely different, something that wasn't mentioned in our discussion of historical uprisings, but feels incredibly relevant to the future of this phenomenon.
Oh, where does your mind go when looking at the modern landscape?
I think about technology. Everything we've discussed today relies on the physical ability of a population to overwhelm the state, to gather in the streets, to communicate, to overpower the guards.
Right.
But if we project current trends forward, if artificial intelligence and digital surveillance eventually give modern authoritarian states absolute panoptic control over their citizens, what happens then?
Wow.
If an algorithm can predict an uprising before it even organizes, and the state can instantly freeze the digital bank accounts of everyone involved, shutting down their ability to travel or buy food with a keystroke, is the sledgehammer permanently locked away? Has the technological window for the human revolution closed forever, leaving us with a future where structural injustice simply can never be physically overthrown?
That is a terrifying evolution of the vacuum we discussed. A perfect, unbreakable order.
It's a heavy thought to mull over. Thank you for exploring these massive foundational concepts with us today. Keep questioning the structures around you, and until next time, keep diving deep.